You are listening to a podcast of Spurious Morality.
Hello and welcome to a podcast of Spurious Morality. I'm Johnston, and with me this week I have Mark.
Hello.
And I have Gareth.
Hello.
And we're carrying on with Blake 7. So previously we started the second series and we did Redemption, we did Shadow, and we did Weapon, and had some interesting conversations about how good it is that Chris Boucher's writing them now and how it's got a little bit more interesting and a bit more confident in this second series. And in this next run of episodes that we're going to cover today, it does something pretty bloody crazy, all things considered. It kind of... I think what happens in Pressure Point, I'm jumping ahead here, but I think what happens in Pressure Point is actually kind of what really consolidates Blake 7 as something that's very memorable and very different. And that's kind of where we are today. I think everything we've had so far it's been a bit safe. Okay, we've pushed the boat out a little bit with some more recent episodes, and we've got a different looking Travis for reasons that we still haven't figured out. Never will. But Pressure Point's the one that really changes things, I think. But before we get to Pressure Point, we have Horizon. Horizon's a curious one. Starts off with a really interesting idea, like spaceship disappears into the dark and the Liberator decide they're going to follow it. But then they end up on this planet and we just seem to go through a lot of territory that we've kind of seen before. There's a lot of sort of colonialist type stuff going on. If you hadn't noticed, basically what this episode is saying is the Federation are bad. That's kind of where it's going. Just if you hadn't picked up on that yet, that's the message here. But there seems to be a lot of talking, a lot of arguing, and the regular cast don't seem to have much of an impact on the story because they seem to teleport down to the planet and then be the thickest people in existence ever and get themselves captured. Avon has his usual, oh, should I do a runner thing on the ship? It just seems to pop up again this episode, even though we'd kind of settled that a whole series ago. And it just kind of... It's a filler episode. Not much happens. It is just an episode of Blake 7. But it just... I think it does the crew a bit dirty. I think they're a bit more of an elite team than they appear here. And I think it's a bit of a shame they don't quite get to shine in the way that they should in this one. Also, I'm not sure we needed Gareth Thomas without his top on. I'm happy to sort of gather opinions on that one from everybody else. But yeah, for me, this one's a bit of a dud. And I think it's actually probably the worst episode so far. In fact, I go as far as to say this is the first worst episode of Blake 7. It's particularly weak. I'm hoping one of you enjoy it more than I do and find a bit more than I do, because there is some strong thematic stuff going on and there's definitely a conversation being had, parallels to the real world and all that, but I think it's just delivered in a very, very clumsy way. So I will be quiet now and I will let Gareth tell us what he thinks about this one.
Okay. Well, I'll be honest. The last time I saw this, I did hate this episode. So I was kind of going into it with much the same kind of head on, like it, it's really hard to get away from just how rubbish the crew are in this one. I'm not going to say that I've turned around and it's great, but I do think there are aspects of it that are, you know, workable. So I like the basic idea. I really like when Blake Seven does world building because I want to know what's the big plan. Like it's not just flying around and shooting Federation spaceships. There's got to be more to it. And I think Blake Seven, for generally obvious budgetary reasons, it's not going to get into we're going to go down to a big busy city and win everybody over, blah blah blah. But this one is an example where they at least try something and they say, right, we're going to find a home base and we're going to, build something there because it's sort of far enough from the Federation that they won't be able to get there easily, which doesn't make any sense because there's Federation people literally on it. So it's like, that's not a great idea, is it? But I do like the kind of basic concept there. And there's some fun little ideas dotted around, like the fact that Blake, when he goes down, deliberately takes Jenna so that Avon is less likely to do a runner, which I agree. Yeah, we should have settled that. But these episodes do actually kind of touch on that continuously, these three. And in this one, it's just kind of a lark that that Avon might run away. But then they get down to the planet, and yeah, it is just an absolute joke where it's just you've got these freedom fighters who are supposed to be taking down a tyrannical regime, and s- 5 of them all get zapped by these tranquilizer things, and it's just embarrassing. Like that's rubbish. Um, and I don't want to assume the writer's motives or anything, but there is a bit of bias in the episode where the focus is kind of not on them. So there's the character Ro, who is the sort of puppet head of the planet, guy who kind of thinks he's actually in charge, but really the Federation are controlling him. It's a pretty obvious colonial um, message we're seeing here. But I do kind of like that they've hired a non-white actor for that role, and similarly for his girlfriend, because it makes it even more obvious that we're talking about, like the British Empire in India or something. Like it's not obvious, but I kind of like that they went that far and they didn't just go, we'll just do this with a bunch of white actors. They're like, no, let's recognize that, the British Empire in India actually not a great thing. I don't know if I'm giving them too much credit here, but that seems like something. Um, there's a couple of other little bits. There's a bit where Callie appears to actually be psychic, which I don't know if that was just a mistake on Alan Pryor's part, but I'm very grateful because, like, if we have to get there by accident, then fine. But as long as Callie can actually do something useful, that would be great. Um, and I suppose the best thing about it, apart from Villa's line, what's the point of being famous if you can't get a last minute booking? Which is you have to listen out for those because he'll do his best to rescue a rubbish episode. The best bit is probably the fact that Avon, with minimal effort, goes down to the planet and it's just like, you people are idiots. I'll do this properly, and just zaps all of the tranquilizer things, and you just kind of think, if this is a double-edged sword because Paul Darrow must have been very happy, and it's a pretty cool sequence, but they just look rubbish that they need Avon to do everything for them. And you just think, how are they going to, achieve anything here? It's one of those episodes that's kind of anathema to the sort of point of the series. You think, who's looking at this and thinking this is a crack team here? Um, and yeah, at the end of the episode, Ro sort of retakes his planet, and Blake is like, well, we've got a friend here. See you next time. And in true Blake Seven fashion, yeah, we won't. So it's ultimately like what was actually achieved here in the slightest. Like Rose had a pretty productive day, but yeah, the episode kind of is more focused on him than it is on Blake Seven. And I think he's pretty good, but yeah, that's not really why people watch the show. So yeah, like whiffs of it aren't terrible, but fundamentally the kind of gag of whoops, the crew has really let themselves, fall over on this one. I think it kind of hurts it. So yeah, it's not great.
I kind of think that there's a really good story in here somewhere. There's genuinely something interesting to say here, but I think you probably need a couple of your main characters actually involved with the conversation, and they're not at all at any point. Yeah, Avon seems cool. Obviously, Paul Darrow will have liked that. We're already seeing that this is Avon's series now. Like, this isn't Blake's series anymore. This is Avon's series now. We're really starting to see that. And that's kind of backed up by the fact that Blake is a bit crap from this point onwards. The events of this episode obviously say to Blake, you know what? We're ready to go and do a strike on Earth now. That's a good idea. We're all doing so well, and we are basically space SAS at this point. Yeah, it's such an interesting setup. I'm glad you mentioned that Villa got a good line in this one, because obviously since we last recorded, we've lost Michael Keating very sadly. He was a fantastic Villa, and you're right, he could absolutely save an episode with an individual line, and it's a real shame that he's gone, because his appearances in Blake 7 and his Big Finish Blake 7 contributions are all absolutely fantastic. We love a bit of Villa.
Yeah, it's very sad that he's gone, and it's a real shame to think there'll be no further Big Finish audios to come from Michael Keating, because he was always great value for money on there.
Yeah, I think the series always needed Villa, and it was his good job. It did always have Villa, the only one to actually appear in every episode. Okay, Mark, talk to us about Horizon.
Well, I think I might, out of the three of us, have enjoyed it the most, and I wasn't really expecting that when I revisited it, because I don't know, maybe it's 5, 6, 7 years since I last did a rewatch of much of Blake 7, and my memory of Horizon is that it's one of those ones to be got through rather than necessarily looked forward to. And I don't know, I find myself sort of pleasantly surprised by it, because I think there's much more. It seemed to be a bit more nuanced and more deftly written than I recalled. Now there are definitely it's uneven, I think, if I could put it that way, because on the one hand you have quite sort of nuanced stuff. You've got this very nice sort of sense of the veneer of respectability over the top of what is clearly just a colonized and enslaved planet. And there's some interesting sort of play around that in the dialogue. There's moments where it's that pairing of Brian Miller, Elizabeth Sladen's husband, there is one of the characters, and his superior, and they land on the planet, and they have these conversations with Ro, where it's very much sort of, they're supposed to be kind of not exactly equals, but there's this sort of etiquette between them, as it were. And they'll say things to him like, "I take it I have your permission to send so and so to the mines," or whatever. And he'll sort of hesitate and go, "Yes, of course," but it's very clear that no other answer would have been acceptable. And when they say things to him like, "We await your orders," it's very clear that what they're really saying is, "We await your complicity." And I think these are all very nice touches. Now, on the other hand, I mean, right at the other end of the subtlety scale, you have, and I find this quite, I don't know, from a 2026 lens, this is really uncomfortable, but there's a sort of almost a white savior kind of dimension to Blake. There's a moment where in the mines, he sort of approaches two of the locals from the planet, and sort of they're fighting over food or whatever, and he's the one to say to them, "No, the way you do this is you first, and then you," like, and he's teaching table manners to these people as though they're being introduced for the first time, and it feels a bit. Yeah, I don't know whether Chris Boucher had a bit of a blind spot around that particular side of it or what, because I think he goes in with very good intentions, but some of that stuff feels not great. Um, and I think so. Another thing that really helps it is sometimes what's not fully there in the writing can be elevated by just one really good performance. And that actor who plays Ro, I had to look up his name again just before this, Darian Gandhi, who seems to have died tragically young, he seems to give it a real extra touch of sensitivity. There's something just really delicate in the way he plays it, and it's quite mesmerizing to watch. Um, a couple of the sort of things to do with just the production of it. This director, Jonathan Wright Miller, he apparently did Shadow, and I think this is uh, the last episode that he directs. And he brings a couple of nice visual touches to it that aren't necessarily on the page. There's an opening shot where you've got the main characters' faces just superimposed over the stars, and they kind of do this nice crossfade thing. And I think it suggests really effectively and concisely this idea of, you know, the weariness of continuous travel and this cumulative stress effect that will then be, brought up in the first scene where they're all suffering from space sickness, or whatever it is they choose to call it this week. But it's just a really nice sort of visual metaphor to bring into that concept. Later on, we have the business with the magnetic barrier, and I think that's really nicely realized on the screen as well. There's a very cool effect around all that that's quite simple, I imagine, to realize, but it works very effectively on screen. There's a nice moment. Well, there's many nice moments for Paul Darrow, has been pointed out already, is increasingly the case. But there's a particularly interesting thing near the start where he in the script he's required to sort of do this bit about how Blake plays the percentages. He mentions this while Blake is notionally elsewhere to the others, and the way it's blocked on screen is that Blake is just happens to be walking back into the room within Avon's peripheral vision while he says, what he sort of says to them, not sotto voce, about him playing the percentages, and Blake seems to take that under his notice. So it's really a nice way of just showing um, that Avon isn't being directly confrontational, but he's letting it, he's dropping the right statements at the right time to keep Blake on the back foot on a few things. I think one thing I really appreciated actually was there was that's sort of main set that they used on the planet. The was a really nice moody set. Like, it feels very, it doesn't feel like a Federation set. It feels like something onto which the Federation has tried to graft its own influence, but is very persistently it's itself. It feels like something of its own culture, and it's just a nice bit of yeah, I suppose it's just nice visuals in that, insofar as it's going to be representative aesthetically of the ultimate act of resistance that is just like ejecting these people from their planet, because it was a graft that was never going to take. So I quite like that the set just sits there very moodily in the background as something that feels very native to the planet and very non-Federation, and yet there's all this attempt to sort of retain a purchase on it. I think really that covers all the main sort of things I have to say about it, except yeah, I think this, despite some of the more sophisticated elements of it, it does begin to descend into this sort of generic minds and slaves kind of thing. It could just as easily be Destiny of the Daleks at one stage. It feels very similar, with people breaking rocks in a mine and plotting their escape and that sort of thing. Um, so, one thing actually I just wanted to say. I know you've already touched on the stuff with Avon and his his one of his regular kind of playing with the idea of being a runner. And we get that again here, but it's another opportunity for Paul Darrow to telegraph. He has a really great ability to telegraph, just even in his facial expressions when he's listening to Zen, this inner conflict that's going on. He seems to just do it with a look, and it's really good. Um, and you can sort of see when the three pursuit ships finally turn up, it's almost like you can sense this palpable relief in him, that he starts laughing, and it's like, right, okay, I don't have to. I think he feels quite vulnerable to already being compromised by something close to friendships in his world, and loyalties and so on, and this thing just breaks him out of that impasse, and he's like, he can feel the gratitude in it, even if he wouldn't acknowledge to himself how far along that path he is. Just a very, very final thing. At the end, I thought it was quite a nice touch that uh, the Roe and the others on the planet decide that they're going to continue calling the planet Horizon, um, because to quote them, we can't return to the past, and that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because it's one of those things. It's one of those thorny issues. I was recently listening to Janet Fielding talking on the season 21 Doctor Who Blu-ray set about her upbringing in Australia. And she mentioned this place called Townsville, and Townsville, I hadn't realized I'd heard of it in the past, but I didn't realize it was named after the slave owner. But they've retained the name, and I think the idea is, look, we don't disown our past, even if we have to problematically face it. And yet, I'm sure there would be a strong counter argument with some that you absolutely do change the name. I don't know. So it's one of those very complicated issues, and I just thought it was good to pay at least lip service. If it's not the most sophisticated thing in the world, to just flag that up quickly at the end. But I thought it was a nice touch. So yeah, I think those are the main things I have to say. And overall, I thought it was pretty decent. Definitely not terrible, and even a little bit above average.
So it was Mark to the rescue. One thing I will absolutely grant you, you're right. This one looks good. It is a good-looking episode of Blake 7, and if we're being really, really honest, there aren't many very good-looking episodes of Blake 7. So yeah, fair enough. Another Doctor Who link, I'm just mentioning it. William Squire, who's the commissar, was the Shadow in the Armageddon Factor. And I thought he actually put a damn good performance in as the Shadow, and he's memorable here at the very least. So yeah, we like a Doctor Who link. Okay, should we move on to Pressure Point then, which is big. So while the second series has definitely felt a little bit more confident, a little bit bolder, and obviously we've brought in some new writers, new voices, it has still been more of the same. Like at the end of each week, we end up in more or less the same place we were at the start of it. It's a bit sitcom-y. I guess the only real change we've had at this point is Aurak's being added to the crew. And Blake's 7 has become Blake's 8 because we're counting Aurak. And when your series is called Blake 7, but there's 8 people knocking about, you need to lose a person. And Pressure Point starts off as something totally different, actually. The whole thing of Pressure Point is we're going to try something big now. We've been rebelling long enough. We've been hitting little targets. We've been knocked out by tranquilizer dart things last week. Let's ignore that. But we're going to go big. We're going to return to Earth. It's the first time that Blake 7 returns to Earth since the first episode of the first series. And Blake's decided he's going to hit a massive target. And there's a huge sort of ethical debate about what he's doing. Like it's very, very clearly set up as innocent people are going to die if you do this. This is rough. And it's just really interesting to see that actually the stuff that we know the Federation's been putting out about them being terrorists and about them being wrong-uns in general, that's kind of the role they're casting here. And there's a very interesting, certainly very interesting for Tea Time 1979, debate on that kind of thing. We actually get into the ethics of Blake 7 for the first time. And then we move on from that, and we have a very, very nasty sort of torture scene. Servalan and Travis torture somebody to death, which is rough. It's grim. Like that scene doesn't really hold back. It's not overtly violent, but the woman is very clearly tortured to death. Travis seems to be at his most psychotic yet. Like whatever happened to him in between series to change his appearance and personalities obviously had an impact, and he does become more of this sort of hard man, violent, thuggy type. The restraint that was there in series one has disappeared entirely now. And obviously, it culminates in a lot more deaths, one of them being Gans. And the whole thing was for nothing. Like, the punchline is the sort of central control that they were trying to get to isn't on Earth and hasn't been there for years, and it's just basically an empty building designed to lure people in and trap them. It's very Blake 7, it's very Federation, it's very Servalan. And yeah, we lose a character, we lose a main character. I'm sure one thing we're all going to discuss is, did they kill the right character? And like, actually, what was Gan's role really in the build up to this? Gan had absolutely pretty much nothing to do. His one sort of character thing was the limiter. We'd done that a couple of times already. Where were they going to go with the guy? Like, it does feel as though there's mileage in every other character here. It takes us a while to get there, maybe, but there's definitely a story to be told. Whereas I just don't think there is with Gan. So personally, I think killing off Gan was the right thing to do. I believe there was some kind of conversation about maybe it should be Villa that was killed off, and I'm so glad that never happened. So yeah, Pressure Point, very interesting. A lot happens. It's probably our roughest episode yet, which is really saying something. Blake 7 has already gone to some pretty unpleasant places. And yeah, we lose one of the crew, and it ends quite suddenly and quite abruptly. There's a reason for that. The reason for that is trial, which we'll talk about afterwards. But yeah, Pressure Point. Talk to us about it, Gareth.
Well, it's interesting that you say that it's doing a lot of new things, because I think there's a lot of familiarity here. It's very, very Terry Nation, season 1, Blake 7 kind of thing. So overtly, it's a lot like Seek, Locate, Destroy, particularly the scene at the end where the gang have decided they're going to go back to rescue Callie, even though it's pretty transparently a trap. There's a debate in the episode about whether they're going to do it, and then they do it anyway. And this episode is kind of like that setup extrapolated to a whole episode, because there's quite a bit of back and forth really about whether they're going to do it. Avon is really upfront about, this will not work. We shouldn't do this. And he gives Blake a little, not ultimatum, but like a countdown. And he's like, if the person you want to reach isn't ready by such and such time, we're not doing it. And Blake actually says, okay, fine, they haven't contacted us, let's go. So there's this back and forth about whether they're actually going to do it that's quite tense. And then the person contacts them, and Blake from that moment on is just completely locked in. Later on, there's a bit where he ignores a question or a concern from Gan, which feels quite pointed by the end of the episode. Yeah, so I really enjoy that tension of kind of, are they going to go into this situation, which we know is, pretty much, if not a trap, they're kind of ready for them. So I really enjoy that. One of my favorite things about Blake 7 is just the team knowing what they're doing, and they're quite competent. Once they get down to the planet, it becomes a little more sketchy in a way that keeps it exciting. So, there's that bit where they've got this field of electric wire effectively, which the props department try their hearts out with. It's quite creative that they've got this wire that if you cut it, it kind of reattaches itself and explodes. And Avon comes up with this routine where he can destroy a bit of it, and that gives them 8 seconds to run across. And that sequence in itself, it kind of reminded me of the Daleks a bit. There's the bit where they have to jump across a chasm, and it's a whole thing. It's like half an episode. And in this, there's a bit where Blake goes over, he's successful, Villa goes over, Gan goes with him, which feels like an unnecessary risk. Like, what are they doing? They're starting to fall apart. Why did they do that? Avon, who is of course always on the ball, he's the most certain to get across there safely, and he trips over. And it's just like, he survives and everything. But I really love that sequence, because it's like, yeah, they're not really, maybe they're not used to getting this far, but it's already starting to fall apart at that point, which I think is quite exciting. Going back to stuff that reminded me of other Terry Nation, we've got another Avalon kind of figure. There's another freedom fighter called Kasabi, who's the woman sadly tortured to death. Um, and that's a nice little bit of world building. It is a tad repetitious because, much like Avalon, Servalan and Travis use her to get to Blake, which I always think is quite funny because they're obsessed with Blake, but they've got these other people who seem to kind of have their stuff together a lot better. And you think, to be honest, I'd be quite pleased with taking that person down if I was in the Federation. Although, unfortunately for Kasabi, the way the scene is shot, when she's actually ambushed by Servalan, it's kind of like, how the hell did you not see her? Like this woman in a giant hat next to these two guards stood on top of a hill. Yeah, it's kind of like, I don't think you're that good at this job, actually. But the whole Kasabi thing, it is quite disturbing, as you say. There's the scene where they kill her. And to be honest, I think the even worse scene for me is the bit where her daughter, who has betrayed Blake and co to keep her mum safe, she's like, well, I've just hollowed out my soul and betrayed everything, but at least my mum is safe. And Travis and Servalan literally laugh at her because she's dead. And it's just, I think that's the most almost cartoonishly evil they've been so far. We are just like, my God, they actually enjoy this, which is just sick. Um, and once we're into the building, trying to get to this computer sequence, which is a little bit amusing because they have to do a bit of set redressing to make it look bigger than it is, which is classic stuff. That's what you do on telly. Doctor Who's been doing that as recently as Gridlock. Um, and then they finally get there, and I really love the scene where Blake, who's been kind of hubris, throughout the episode. Like I say, once he decides on this course of action, he's dead set on it. He says, "We've done it. We've done it. I've done it." And I really love that he shifts to the I at the end there because yeah, he's kind of huffing his own paint. Really, he's sort of high on his own legend. And of course, at that moment, it's all taken away, which I think is again very Terry Nation, because if you think of the first episode of Blake Seven, like that was incredibly bleak. And this has a kind of similar feel of like, to be honest, I don't think you're going to win this. And of course, that is compounded by Gan's death. And I'll be honest, I think it's the one part of the episode that's really not shot very well. Like I remember thinking this the first time I saw it, but it's sort of not clear what's happened. And it's not a great death scene for David Jackson, to be honest, but the fact of his death is very impactful. Um, I remember when we were talking about Seek, Locate, Destroy, it occurred to me that it might make that a stronger episode if Blake's hubris in deciding that they're going to go and rescue Callie results in a death. Because frankly, Travis should win occasionally. Like that was his first episode, and he flunked right out the gate. This time I get my wish. So Travis doesn't quite succeed to the extent he would like, but he achieves a sort of Pyrrhic victory because he manages to kill Gan. So in a weird sense, this feels like Seek, Locate, Destroy 2.0 with the bonus of killing off Gan. And I'll be honest, yeah, Gan is the one to get rid of. That's nothing against David Jackson, but I think he sort of visibly looks a bit uncomfortable sometimes in Blake Seven just because he has nothing to do. Like you remember in Galaxy Quest, the joke about Sigourney Weaver was that her character's job was to just repeat what the computer just said. Gan is honestly not far from that. Like a lot of the time, he's just like, Avon's down on the planet. Like, yeah, we know. Like, he just hasn't got anything to do because they've introduced the limiter, and they've gone, here is this giant bloke who looks like he can tear through you. We've specifically made it that he cannot do that. And it's like, well, what is he then? What's he for? In this episode, he's very easily fooled by a duplicitous young woman. It's like, this is not a great asset to the team, I'll be honest. So yeah, it feels harsh to be like, oh, thank God they got rid of that character. Because it's like, well, that's an actor, he's doing his best. But I don't think the series really found anything for him to do. I'm very much looking forward to Mark's take on that. Another thing I mentioned, the Servalan and Travis relationship in this is terrific because you've got that evil laughter scene, but you've also got the moment at the end where, flowers for Jenna. Like, I'd genuinely forgotten about Jenna at this point, and she just suddenly comes to the rescue and gets a gun on Servalan and Travis. This might be my favorite Jenna sequence, to be honest. But all of a sudden, Servalan is pleading, like, "Oh no, don't let them harm me." And Travis is like, "How is that important? We've got Blake here." And you can see this schism between the two of them, and Servalan is disgusted with him. But at the same time, because earlier in the episode, Kasabi has just ripped strips off of Servalan and said she's this venal, pathetic creature who shouldn't be in charge of anything. And you're like, yeah, like she's incredibly charming. She's very persuasive, but this is not a stable woman. And you see this sequence where she's like, "I'm the only important thing in this room," and Travis is like, "Are you mad? Like, have you forgotten what the point of all this is?" And I have to say, I'm coming around on Brian Croucher as well, because it is worlds apart from Stephen Greif. Like, the only way I can really deal with it is to kind of tell myself, this doesn't make any sense, but this is a regeneration. He's regenerated into another guy. All right. So it's the same character, completely different temperament. I'm used to this. I like Doctor Who. I can cope with this. Because he's, as you say, he is completely off the deep end next to Stephen Greif. But I think in this episode, it's kind of handled quite well because he's really competent. Like, he's terrifying because he's, completely psychotic. He always seems like he's kind of one impulse away from just battering people. Like, you think he's probably going to whack Servalan around the head at some point. But yeah, I was kind of here for it this time. I was like, yeah, okay, I see what he's doing. He's a deeply angry man. Um, and he just doesn't have he doesn't have any chill left. So yeah, I was really impressed with him. I like the fact that right at the end, he's chucking a grenade because he's, I don't care, we're gonna kill as many people as possible. Absolute monster. So so yeah, I think it's a pretty ruthless episode. Oh yeah, there's another thing I liked. There's a sequence where Avon openly talks to Blake about his plans to go away with the Liberator. They've reached a kind of civilized point where Blake is like, oh, Avon kind of manipulates him into this, but he's like, well, you'll be the leader on Earth. Guess that means someone's got to have the Liberator, haven't they? And it's like, well, he's not doing it behind his back, though. I think that's an interesting kind of place for the two characters where he's like, look, I want the Liberator. I want the Liberator. Let's just rip the plaster off. That is the plan. And I really like that. It's as you said in the previous episode, it could get a bit repetitive of having Avon always with one foot out the door. And I think kind of making it sound like, well, it's just good sense is kind of more interesting. So, R.I.P. Gan and everything. His death may be the weak point of the episode for me, but yeah, I think it's pretty tremendous as Blake 7 goes. It hits all the beats of they're good at what they do, but it is kind of hopeless. I think that's sort of Blake 7 in a nutshell, really.
Yeah, you're right about the death not being a particularly great scene itself, but I do like Gan's last words, which are "I'm not worth dying for." And David Jackson does give it some welly, but it's the direction and the editing is just a bit weird. It's a bit rushed. Are we? Is it because they can't really show somebody being crushed to death particularly well or accurately or before the watershed, or is it because an effect didn't work out? But yeah, there's something just slightly off about it, absolutely. But the impact of that scene is worth it. What it produces is worth it, even if it doesn't quite come off the right way at the time. Go on, Mark. Talk to us about Pressure Point.
Well, the good news is Gan isn't actually dead because you can very clearly see him breathing afterwards. When he's lying there with supposedly having having carked it. But no, obviously that's just an unfortunate thing. You've got a big actor lying there, and they don't have the ability in those days to freeze out bits of the picture or anything like that. So it's basically like, okay, David Jackson, can you just lie there and do your best attempt at shallow breathing in that position? Great. You're dead. Just try and look as dead as you can, and we'll just ignore the rising and falling of your chest there, you know. Um, but in all seriousness, I think despite that, look, it is it's a bit of a perfunctory moment of death, but I suppose in a way that just in a way that's strangely effective, whether intentional or as a side effect. Just the brevity of that is so chilling, you know. There he is as one of our regulars, and the other thing I quite like about it is, um, you know, it was a kind of an innovative enough thing to do to kill a main character like that in a show like that. Um, you know, long before Game of Thrones did shock kills every so often and so on, but it's like there it is, and it's not even the mid-season tentpole. It actually comes slightly earlier than I was expecting. On this rewatch, I'd kind of forgotten that it was episode 5, and even that is kind of just going, this could happen anytime. You know, it's not like this is our big mid-season event. It's we're just doing this now because this is going to happen at some point to one of these guys. So, but I absolutely agree that Gan was the character to go. David Jackson himself said so. You know, he practically volunteered for it because it just made the most sense when he realized the limitations of his character, and it would have been insane to get rid of Villa. So they made the right move there clearly. Um, just to momentarily step into the completely frivolous. What the heck is Villa wearing in this one? There's some sort of weird like half poncho, yellow. I don't know what that thing is. That's sort of, but anyway, it's a bold fashion choice, whatever it is. Um, I don't know whether that's a June Hudson one or somebody else. I didn't
I think it's
clock.
still June Hudson, and
Is it
I'd just
June?
like to point out we have all slept on the costumes here. They are nuts in these
Yeah,
episodes.
some of them are really really
Servalan's
out there.
hat in Pressure Point, astonishing.
Oh yeah. Oh, and that reminds me actually, when you were talking about how 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 visible Servalan should have been stood up on that hill there. It's a very effective shot, but it did remind me, as you were talking about it there, suddenly of the Five Doctors. You know that the clear visibility of the Cybermen to everyone with the slightest bit of peripheral vision until they're required to see them. You know, but I guess you just have to take it as one of those bits of look. This is TV grammar for you haven't been noticed until this moment, rather than this is the literal uh, depiction of that. But anyway, I agree that the Kasarbi thing works well in this, but is a little repetitious. But I think it works better than Avalon because they've been careful to entwine it with Servalan's past and make it much of a personal vendetta and so on. I had to laugh when she's getting in as you were saying, Gareth. She's getting into that sort of very personal stuff with the back and forth between Kasarbi and Servalan, and she's losing her sense of the bigger picture, and then Travis comes in with this is no time for a personal vendetta, which is just hilarious coming from him because his entire life is one big personal vendetta, but yeah, there's a very strange little bit of direction actually concerning Kasarbi because she at one stage she's in that sort of interrogation room with those two, and she gets up and makes what I can only describe as a very limp and casual attempt to escape from the room, and is immediately met within like 2 feet by guards at the door. And you could say, like, that's just a show of defiance. She didn't really expect to get out of there, but there's something just so I don't know. It was just so lumpen the way it was done. It kind of was unintentionally comedic, which is unfortunate, given how serious the situation was there. Um, One little thing concerning that as well is Kasarbi's daughter. She's I found it a slightly. I sort of went back and forth on whether that was a good or a bad casting choice because she's played by, and I didn't recognize or I hadn't remembered initially that this was the case, but she's played by Yolanda Palfrey, who later turns up as isn't it on the Hyperion 3 as a sort of cabin steward in Trial of the Time Lord. She's another actor who died tragically young. But she she's there's something almost a bit too vulnerable about her. Something about the casting choice. she's not, she's not not necessarily the strongest actor at that point either. But there's something quite. She doesn't seem a good fit for somebody who's sort of battle hardened by her mother, and who her mother would believe to be okay in these kind of frontline situations. And you could say, look, she's meant to be one of the pressure points of the episode, and therefore they needed to cast somebody who was sort of on that line between somebody who could plausibly be there and someone who just looks vulnerable. But I think it was possibly a little too much into the latter of those two things. Um, but all in all, it sort of it gives. Well, I suppose one thing it does is it gives Gan a final chance to sort of be seen to be this very stoic and kind character, because he's so thoughtful towards her when the rest of them are all distracted. And it's a sort of final moment of grace, really, for Gan and for David Jackson to be able to play, in the ruins of that old church there, and you've got this lovely sort of background of the previously sacred space. And there's always been something a little uh stoically monastic about Gan almost. He fits that, as a final place to be almost. He sort of suits that as his kind of little, final regular moment there. There's something quite pleasing about that background, because he is just this sort of almost monkish guy, and actually, if it hadn't already sort of gone out the window already, I think that sort of thing puts paid to that. You remember the liberation book theory we discussed before, where Gan was supposedly a thinly veiled psychopath with only the limit. The limiter is his sort of grafted on personality, and the real Gan is this sort of seething, psychopath. I really don't think. I think we're long past the point where we can plausibly argue that as something terribly convincing, because it's clear that this is the real him, and he just the limiter. It's when the limiter malfunctions that he's not himself. So it's yeah, so he's very much just himself here towards the end, and it's quite nice. It's sort of poignant that he is, as you were saying, Gareth, is he's the one that almost talks Blake out of the whole mission at a couple of points. But in a sense, he also kind of talks him into it as well, because there's a point where near the very beginning, I think it's Gan that comes up to Blake and says, "You think you can do it without us?" And Blake says, "I'd rather not try," but he is willing to go alone. So it's not. I think it slightly mitigates some of uh, Blake's ultimate responsibility there. Not completely, of course, because he is slightly manipulating them into going as usual. But um, uh, yeah. So I think those are the main. There's a couple of nice touches. There's a at the very beginning there, when they have that little what's it called, like a little sort of cabin in the woods, we ruined cottage sort of thing. And it's just really cool that they've got this almost TARDIS like interior. You go in and it's this high tech thing on the inside, or probably more likely just underneath in a kind of a bunker. I think they have a periscope going up, don't they, through the chimney and all that. But that was a nice little bit of business. Yeah, I think those are the main things I had jotted down to chat about. Oh, I tell you what I really like, actually, just very quickly. That moment where they first come back and they've got the planet Earth on the screen. And I know you were already saying, Johnson, that that's this is our first time back to Earth since um, the way back. But I like the fact that it's only Jenna who says something. She says, who actually uh, verbalizes something. She says, "It's been a long time." And then you cut to Blake, and Blake's just taking it in silently. He's just watching. So there's a nice bit of restraint in that, isn't there? Like, it sort of shows um, that it touches on that idea. Like, anyone who's been watching the series since the beginning knows that in his head he's remembering that thing of, no, I will be back. Um, and we don't need to do this flashback or anything like that. It's not as heavy handed as that. We just have the moment to be registered for the long term viewer, if they're uh, sharp enough to catch it. So Yeah, I really, I mean, it's obviously an iconic episode and one of the real talking points of the series, and it's done really well. The sort of I think one aspect I'll just very quickly talk about is I really like how Chris Boucher, he knows exactly what to do because he understands the series can only present it can only do so much practically. So he sets up these things where it's a bit obvious, the ruse of the bunker and so on is a bit obvious, but then when they get in, he will cover in dialogue very deftly some bit of business that sort of makes it more complicated than it initially appeared, but they don't have to show that, they just sort of talk it through, and there's this really nice intricate dance between those 2 things that a lesser writer, I don't think, would do quite as well. It's hard to pin down, but he there's a really he's just very good at that stuff, and I really appreciate that, and I think that elevates everything, um, as we've been noticing. So yeah, that's all I'll say about Pressure Point. But yeah, I liked it.
It's it's an undeniably strong episode, and I think it's a very, very, very strong episode for Terry Nation as well. It calls back to the first episode just enough, but doesn't quite have a level of continuity that it could have done. It could have been a bit closer. We could have seen. I can't remember. I'm assuming he was called Tarrant because isn't everybody the bad guy from the first episode that got away at the end, basically. He could have put in an appearance. That could have been nice. There could have been a bit of a callback there. And there's another slightly weird callback later in the series to the first episode, but we'll cross that bandage bridge when we come to it. Next up, there's Trial, and I like Trial for a lot of reasons. I do dislike it for one reason as well, but Trial genuinely stops, pauses the series, and goes, okay, let's talk about consequence. Let's talk about what's actually happened in the last few weeks, in the last episode. Let's talk about how it's affected our characters, because the dynamic has changed now, and we're not just going to do Adric wouldn't want us to mourn, let's go on holiday, even though that hadn't happened yet. It stops for an episode and it talks about what went on, and we sort of get a nice couple of parallel storylines. There's Travis being blamed for everything by Servalan and is literally put on trial, and then you've got Blake, who goes down to a planet and does a bit of philosophizing with a rather annoying alien. Actually, that's the bit I don't like, the sort of the Blake side of the story, because it's a little bit too weird and philosophical, and meanwhile the stuff that's happening with Travis is really, really exciting. It does something that Blake 7 does quite rarely. It actually brings another character back. It's Rontaine, which is Peter Miles' character from, I think it was Seek, Locate, Destroy. No, well, it can't have been. Yeah, Seek, Locate, Destroy, maybe. Anyway, he comes back and he meets a pretty grisly end in this. Travis is great. Like the whole Travis side of this episode is just absolutely fantastic, and Brian Crouch is on fire. It's so good, and Servalan is at her most evil, and you just feel like the bad guys have gotten nastier, and are more emboldened because of what happened in the last episode. Whereas there's a genuine conversation going on about sort of chucking Blake out because he has gone too far. And he absolutely has. It did result in the death of Gan. Like it's genuinely Blake is forced to face the consequences of what he's done. Just the way it's presented doesn't quite work for me. But all in all, I think this is a really good episode. It's completely different from pretty much any other Blake 7. And I really like what it does. Obviously, it kind of ends with the status quo on the Liberator being resumed, although there's maybe a little bit more hostility there now than there was before. But it completely changes where Travis is up to. Not sure the series makes the most of it, but Travis is now on the run as well. So Travis is a fugitive just as much as the Liberator crew. it's a nice little twist. It's a nice change of dynamic, and it feels as though the Travis storyline is going somewhere. And as we know with hindsight, it does conclude at the end of this season. It doesn't just drag on forever and ever and ever. It has a very, very definitive ending, and it feels like we're moving towards that now. So I'm all for something that makes Blake Seven feel like it's moving forward. If Pressure Point was sort of the final episode of the old way of how the series was, this is the beginning of the new way. This is a bit of a reintroduction. It just moves the pieces around the board a tiny little bit and prepares us for something very familiar but different enough, I guess. Go ahead, Gareth.
I'm not that big a fan of it, to be honest. I do like some of the stuff about it. So I agree. Brian Croucher is very good. It's as long as you're on board with the Stephen Greif is gone, this is a completely different type of performance. It's very good within that. He spends the whole thing kind of glowering at the tribunal, and you just think at any moment he's going to get up and just twist their heads off or something. So that's quite tense. It's good that I really like the scene where the officer who sort of used to work with him kind of comes in and visits him for a bit. Um, and Travis kind of believably maintains this authority over him in a not in an aggressive way, in a kind of he is his superior way, even though he's literally in a jail cell and this guy's got a gun on him. So it's just that's all very good. That's very good stuff for Brian Croucher in particular. I like the cast of the whole trial stuff. You've got not trying to be cheeky to the guy, but you've got a surprisingly restrained performance from John Savadent, who I only know as a slightly charmingly cartoony guy from Coronation Street. And Peter Miles, and I forget the other actor's name. They do like a little Greek chorus thing in the corner where they're just kind of nattering about what's going on. It's always nice to have Peter Miles in something, isn't it? So that's all very entertaining. I like the fact that Travis's counsel tries a few dirty tricks to do better for her client, which includes reading out the names of all the people supposedly killed. Don't know why that's supposed to make Travis sound better, but she seems pretty confident about it. The problem is, of course, the Blake stuff. Now, I do like that there is a parallel story going on. I like that Travis and Blake are both kind of, for very different reasons, having a sort of dark night of the soul kind of thing. I think Travis's might be more meaningful in a sense because he ends up completely changing his career really. But Blake, I know that he's essentially making amends for what's happened on his watch. But Avon is the first to kind of roll his eyes and be like, well, for a grand gesture of apology, he is holding all of us sort of hostage on the ship a bit, and we all have to wait for him to have his big sulk on the planet. So it's not perhaps as magnanimous as it appears, um, because I think Blake, whether or not he means to, he is very manipulative. There was that thing in Pressure Point where he's like, "Well, I'll go down on my own," and you're like, they can't let you do that. That's so you're not. Are you really giving them the choice there, or are you just going right? Well, I'll go off and die then. And he goes off to the planet, and this is where you are very aware that it's a Chris Boucher episode because you've got these two ideas that he will link up at the end, but my God, they have nothing to do with each other. I mean, they've got this planet that is just this Star Trek nonsense of just this living organism, and it kind of comes to life now and again and then eats all of the living things on it and goes to sleep for a bit. And yeah, you've got this Zill person on it. And the first time I watched the episode, I was just like hoarse with laughter because of the brave but ill-advised choices of the actress playing the alien, who's kind of doing this kind of bird-like movements and like sticking her tongue out at random, which is like, look, we haven't got much to work with, okay? It's hard to seem like an alien when you haven't got a big blobby head, but it does largely just risk looking silly. Not to mention, and I know this is one of those things, like Mark was saying about, well, it's very difficult to make an actor look like he's dead. It's very difficult to light a location set. So they're always under this giant heat lamp. I mean, they honestly look like, you know, they're for sale in a cafe. Like they're a couple of sausages or something. They've just got this bright yellow light in their faces all the time. So the planet stuff I just think is a bit farcical, really. I just watched that and kind of think, was this in Chris's like slush pile? Um, and you sat through the episode thinking, God, where is this even going? And then at the end, Blake somehow gets his mojo back and he's like, all right, we'll go and attack Serverland Station. And then you have this incredible irony of Blake actually rescuing Travis, which I hope there's some sort of reference to later on. I have my doubts, but that is such a marvelously, like, you know, cruel twist of fate kind of thing where it's just ridiculous that Blake's actions would actually cause Travis to survive. Um, I don't know. I watched the CGI version, or rather the new version of the episode, where you can really see the ship approaching on the screen behind John Savardin. That's quite creepy. I like that. I can't remember what it looked like on the original version. I will watch it again at some point because I'm watching all of my old telly with the other half. But yeah, that looked pretty good. Um, I don't know why Blake fires one shot and then carries on and goes away. That didn't make a huge amount of sense to me. Maybe they were running away from Federation ships. But yeah, it feels a bit bitty to me, this episode. It's got elements that I think are good. Um, but yeah, the actual Blake side of it, his whole crew, that whole side of it is a bit like it feels weird to be cutting away and going, well, let's see how Travis is doing this week. Like, I don't think that's bad, but it's like I should probably be more interested in Blake, right? Like I should want to go back to the Liberator. But to be honest, the dynamics on that space station with Serverland, Travis, those minor characters we've all mentioned already, that's more interesting. So yeah, it's in its way typically wobbly Chris Boucher scripts, and I don't mean like his scripts are always wobbly. I just mean when they're wobbly, they're like this, where you've got kind of ideas kind of running concurrently, and you kind of go, yeah, all right, we could tie these up, but I don't know if these two things really speak to each other. Um, so yeah, I always come away from it kind of feeling like bits of it. I like bits of it, but yeah, it's pretty thin stuff after Pressure Point. One thing I will say though, I do like that. I was wrong-footed because I get to the start of this and I go, right, this is the one where Serverland has put Travis on trial for messing up that operation in the previous episode. No, she hasn't. She's put him on trial for something else, um, simply to delay and obfuscate the fact that it was actually her fault what went wrong. So she obviously knows that she can't put Travis on trial for that operation, possibly because of that embarrassing episode where she was like, "Oh, what about me? What about me?" at the end of Pressure Point. And I think that's really, really good shiftiness for Serverland to be like, "All right, let's dredge up this thing from his past and randomly put him on trial for that. That will be enough to finish him." Um, so I like that. She's a real snake. But yeah, I'll hand over. That's about it.
I'm glad it's not just me that finds the Blake bits really irritating. That's good. What about you, Mark?
I really like all of it, and I actually listening to that, I understand that thing of the disconnect between what's going on with the Blake strand and the definitely much more uh at first glance anyway interesting stuff going on with the trial. Um, I did, and I don't know whether I've clocked this on previous occasions, and it's entirely possible I might just have a wrong reading of it this time. But some other layer of it came in for me this time, and it was particularly sort of it was that final exchange between Blake and Avon where he takes him aside when the others have gone. So Blake's been rescued safely from the planet at the last minute and all the rest of it. And Avon takes him to one side while the others are heading off elsewhere, and he says, "You handled them very skillfully," and that's that in itself is fine. That's Avon's naturally cynical read on it, right? Um, but it's more so the way Gareth Thomas chooses to react, or I think it might be fair to say Blake is scripted to react in that moment because he's very cool. He's unoffended. He just looks him in the eye like, "Yeah, you got me." And I think what it's saying is Blake wasn't really, in terms of getting his mojo back by God of the Planet, I don't think he ever really lost it. I think it's possible. It's one possible read of the thing because if you watch him on that planet as well, he doesn't look like a man. He's not. I don't know how you would sell the idea of this anyway. Walking around an uninhabited planet, an almost uninhabited planet to his eyes, but he's walking around. He just looks. He just looks blank. He's not a man who's overtly suffering in the way he's playing it. So I wonder is he just simply he knows what he needs to do to play on the sympathies of the crew and get everyone back in line, and he does it. So in fact, when Avon says everything but the self pity is not real, I think it's possible that none of it is real. And I don't mean that he doesn't feel grief for Gan. I just mean that he's never really had this crisis of faith in himself, and he just needs to play the cards right to get it all back as quickly as possible, how things were, and get on with the mission. That's how I saw it this time. I don't think I've necessarily spotted that on previous occasions, and as I say, I could be wrong. But if that is intended to be in the text of the thing, then there is a stronger link, if you like, between that and the trial strand, because it's sort of saying, well, look, there's manipulation going on over here by the Federation to get this guy, to get Travis fitted up for, they choreograph it very specifically so that without it without it looking too manipulated, it has been so. Um, Talking of that, by the way, that there's a really nice bit of just actual actor choreography where those two characters, Rontaine and I forget the name of the other guy, but the two of them sort of having their bit of a gossip after everyone has left the trial proceedings for the day, and they step right up onto that judges platform thing. So they're kind of looking down as though they're playing the game of look where the judges here, and let's anticipate the moves on the chessboard. Um, and it's kind of written like they're trying to be amateur psycho strategists in this moment. They don't have Carnell's, they don't quite have Carnell's ability to see around every corner. Otherwise they'd have anticipated being observed by hidden camera. And they'd have made sure they weren't dead at the end of it. But yeah, there's just a sense of that kind of puppeteer psycho strategist aspect in the writing is you feel like they're kind of nearly cosplaying at that at that kind of thing. I quite like that sort of dimension to it. I also like the fact that you initially get those two guards standing outside as your introduction to the trial. So you get the sort of notionally lower part of the hierarchy, the sort of grunts on the door there. But even they have their little bit of power. Like if that guy had done an actual runner, they could have shot him in the back and so on. So it feels like although there's a sort of a notional hierarchy, the whole thing is perfectly designed so that nobody is safe. There's just this kind of background radiation of fear and watching your back at all times, and that's really effective. Um, I kind of forgotten that John Savinan was in this because in my head I always associate him with a much later episode that where uh where he pops up again in a slightly more OTT fashion. Um, but anyway, spoilers on that one, Gareth, because I think maybe you'd forgotten that one, or maybe you don't know about that one. I don't know, but he does pop up again as a different guy.
To be fair, I
Um,
enjoy his Hamier episode as well.
oh
There's
yeah, you
room
do.
for all John Savidans. That's fine.
All right, maybe you were playing the game of don't tell the listener, but so I've possibly messed up there. So apologies. Um, but yeah, that sort of thing is very interesting as well. Of like you were saying, they've kept the sort of Damocles dangling over um, Travis's head all this time. That if he keeps in line and keeps delivering results, the deferred trial will never come. But all of a sudden here it is fast tracked because he's messed up. Um, and so suddenly the butcher of Zercaster, as I think Caldor City refers to him, is up on all these charges, and he's absolutely not going to get out of this. It will be a complete stitch up. Not that he doesn't deserve it, but you know what I mean. It's organized so that he gets um he gets the death penalty and so on. But yeah, so uh sorry, just talking about those two guards before the at the door, that one of those guys is the character of Power. um this is me being 3 for 3 on the mentioning actors who died tragically young. So sorry about being so morbid, but it's a kind of poignant thing that you see him have that moment where he shares the drink with Travis, because that actor unfortunately died at the age of 49 after a long struggle with alcoholism, and just a week, I think, after he was sacked from the Bill, a long running role in the Bill, because he just couldn't he just wasn't coping, and it's very sad. So to see that, the wee shared drink scene was a poignant thing. Um, just to bring a bit of needed levity in after that. And it's a tiny little thing, but I thought it was fun that they had on the deck of the Liberator in this episode a little Star Wars type little games table. I wonder, because this would have been made in 1978, ahead of the early 79 broadcast. Were those Star Wars influences coming in a wee bit, and already, and you had, do you remember in the Millennium Falcon you had that little games table thing with the holographs and whatnot? So here they've just got, like, the BBC version is to have a very similar looking table, but just put little um giant chess pieces made out of toilet rolls or something in it, and spray them in glitter. So that was fun. Um, the part of Zill on that planet, I am just like, I kind of I'm in two minds on it, because yeah, it does look a bit ridiculous, but you have to admire how she really commits to the bit there, and there's something, actually, she was putting me in mind this time of something of somebody else, actually, and I suddenly realized halfway through who it was, and it was Anjali Mohindra in the Nikola Tesla episode of Doctor Who, where she plays the Schizophrenia Queen. Very, very similar movements and choices, and just the use of her eyes and how she would enunciate. And it was almost like Anjali Mohindra had seen that and taken some of her cues from that performance. I hope I'm not damning her with inadvertently faint praise there or something, but it just put me in mind of that. Um, I think it's really nice that in the week after Gan's death, uh, well, two things about that. Firstly, I think you can feel how the good lines are already spread a little more fairly out amongst everybody. I mean, Paul Darrow is still getting the lion's share of the best ones. And you can understand why. You don't waste gold on everybody, but yeah, I do feel like there's a more uniform doling out of the good lines between all the cast. But there's a really nice thing as well, where Gan kind of gets a voice in this episode in a very clever way, because they're sitting there, and I think it's Villa, or is it Jana? Villa, I think, who says, "I wish Gan was here." And Evan says something very sarcastic, like, "Oh yeah, I'm sure that would have made all the difference." But he says, "Well, what would he be asking at this point? He'd think of something very simple but very important." And they suddenly realize that what he would have asked would have been, "Did Blake leave a message?" Which he has. So there is this sense of, um, Gan still playing this part. Just the whole left behind is still felt, because that piece of the machinery wasn't there. And I just thought that was really, really nice and really thoughtful bit of writing. Um, oh yeah, one final thing. This is the sort of stuff that keeps me awake at night. So how was Zill communicating with Blake? I have to assume it's some sort of telepathy. That's my headcanon for that one. The planet creates some sort of telepathic field, and they're able to communicate without it being strictly language in the true sense or something. Um, and actually, that reminds me just to say one final thing. I think it's a really nice conceit, a beautiful conceit actually, that they had that business of the whole creative impetus for Zill's rationale of protecting Blake being that she saw the teleport field, that sort of white ready break outline around Blake when he arrived, and went, "That's an egg." She saw the outline and thought, "That's an egg. That's somebody hatching from an egg, and therefore that's of the planet." And I just thought that's really clever. That's taking, a fairly ropey 1978 produced BBC effect and going, let's make poetry out of that. I think that's lovely. And yeah, I think that's probably all the main points I have to say about it. But yeah, I can see that thing. It's two different things running in parallel. Whether they connect as organically as might be ideal, I don't know. But I just enjoyed all of it. I just thought I wasn't bored by any one part more than the other. I just thought the whole thing knitted together really pretty elegantly, and I think it was my favorite of the three.
It's certainly given us a lot to talk about, which I think is the point of the episode, really. It's going to have its lovers, it's going to have its haters. It's very different, and I quite like it. I like what it does. I do think it's far better that the series paused and reflected than just carried on without Gan, or gave us some big revenge mission that went right, and that'd have been boring. It was an interesting point, I think, that Gareth made about essentially when the Liberator does attack Space Command, it's essentially knock and run. Like one shot and then we'll leg it, but that one shot is all it needs. Okay, so I think it's been 3 interesting episodes. We've definitely had a dud in Horizon, but then Pressure Point and Trial, I really do think they have their own merits. They're very different episodes, but what they do is pretty good. It's pretty entertaining, and it's very different to a lot of what TV was doing at the time, and it's very different to a lot of other Blake 7 as well, even though it still does feel like safe territory. So we'll come back fairly soon, and we will discuss the next 3 episodes where, for the first time, really, the crew starts to have a proper mission now. It starts to feel as though the series is going somewhere and building to something, and I'm really looking forward to getting to Star 1 because I think it's absolutely cracking. But we've a bit of a way to go yet. But for now, we'll leave it there. We're out of time. So I'll say a huge thank you and goodbye to Mark.
Thank you. Bye.
And a huge thank you and goodbye to Gareth.
Ta-ra.
And we'll be back for more Spodcasting very soon. Goodbye now.